Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to Horror Whispers. Tonight, we leave behind the safety of the cities and drift into the mist-shrouded highways of the Pacific Northwest. Towering evergreens close in on forgotten logging roads, rain beats endlessly against cracked asphalt, and fog curls through mountain passes where daylight rarely lingers. For truckers, these routes are more than just long hauls. They are corridors of dread, places where headlights seem to catch things that shouldn't be there, and where the wilderness itself feels alive. These 11 terrifying stories come directly from truckers who braved the Pacific Northwest's most isolated stretches of road. Each tale carries with it a chilling reminder. Sometimes the greatest dangers aren't the weather, the terrain, or the endless miles, but what waits just beyond the beam of your headlights. If you're new to Horror Whispers, don't forget to subscribe for daily true horror stories that reveal the darkest corners of reality. Turn on the notification bell so you never miss the chilling tales that others dare not share. So get ready, turn off the lights, and settle in. Tonight, you'll hear stories that make even the strongest truckers look back in the mirror. My name is Maria Santos, and I've been driving long haul for 8 years now. Mostly I stick to the I-5 corridor, but sometimes the money's too good to pass up on those coastal runs. This particular night I was hauling a load of computer equipment from Seattle down to San Francisco, and the dispatcher had me taking Highway 101 along the Oregon coast to avoid some construction delays on the inland routes. It was October 15th, 2023, and the weather was absolutely brutal. The kind of Pacific Northwest storm that makes you question why anyone ever thought it was a good idea to build roads through these mountains in the first place. Rain was coming down so hard my wipers could barely keep up, even on the fastest setting. The wind was howling something fierce, rocking my trailer every time I hit an exposed stretch of highway. Visibility was maybe 50 feet on a good stretch, and there weren't many of those. I'd been fighting this weather for about 3 hours when I hit that particularly nasty section of 101 just south of Lincoln City. You know the one, where the highway hugs the cliff face and you've got nothing but angry Pacific Ocean on one side and jagged rock on the other. No shoulder to speak of, no guardrails that would do you much good if you actually needed them. The kind of road that makes even experienced drivers white-knuckle the steering wheel. It was about 2:30 in the morning and I hadn't seen another vehicle in over an hour. The CB was mostly static, with occasional bursts of chatter from other drivers, warning about conditions further up the line. My fuel was good, my load was secure, and I was making decent time despite the weather. I was actually starting to feel pretty confident about the run when I saw her. At first, it was just a flash of white in my headlight beams. Could have been anything. A piece of trash blown across the road. A bird confused by the lights, maybe just the rain playing tricks on my eyes. But as I got closer, slowing down because something about it didn't look right, I realized it was a woman in a white dress. She was standing maybe 10 feet off the roadway, right at the edge where the asphalt meets the gravel shoulder. Perfectly still, despite the wind and rain that should have been tearing at her clothes. The dress looked like something from decades ago. Long sleeves, high neckline, the kind of thing you'd see in old photographs. And she was just standing there, facing the road like she was waiting for something. Now I've got 2 daughters of my own, and I was raised to never drive past someone who might need help. But everything about this situation felt wrong. What was a woman doing out here in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of the worst storm I'd seen in months? How had she gotten here? There were no broken-down vehicles nearby, no signs of an accident, and why wasn't she seeking shelter? I slowed my rig down to maybe 15 miles per hour, hazards flashing, and tried to get a better look. She was young, maybe mid-20s, with long dark hair that hung straight down despite the wind. Her skin was pale, not just pale but almost luminous in the headlight beams. and she was looking directly at my truck as I approached. That's when I noticed her feet. I've got good eyes, better than most drivers my age, and I keep my headlights well maintained. So I know what I saw, even though my mind didn't want to accept it. Her feet weren't touching the ground. She was floating maybe 6 inches above the gravel, perfectly motionless except for the slight swaying you might see from something hanging in the wind. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to keep driving, to get as far away from this stretch of road as possible. But I couldn't stop thinking about my own daughters, about how I'd want someone to help them if they were stranded. So I pulled over, air brakes hissing, and grabbed my rain slicker from behind the seat. The moment I opened my door, the temperature dropped. I'm talking about a 20-degree difference, instant and sharp enough that I could see my breath. The rain that had been warm enough to fog my windows was suddenly cold as ice, stinging my face like needles. And the sound of the storm just stopped. Oh, I could still see the rain falling, could still see the trees bending in the wind, but everything had gone completely silent. I called out to her, had to shout to be heard over what should have been the storm noise, but my voice sounded muffled and strange. "Ma'am, you need help? I can give you a ride to town." She turned to face me fully then, and I saw her eyes. They were my sister Carmen's eyes. Carmen, who had died in a car accident 12 years ago. Carmen, who used to wear a white dress just like that one to church every Sunday when we were kids. Carmen, who had been dead and buried for over a decade but was somehow standing 20 feet away from me on a deserted stretch of Highway 101. "Maria," she said, and her voice carried perfectly despite the distance and the storm. "You shouldn't have stopped." I felt my legs go weak. This wasn't possible. Carmen was buried in San Antonio, had been for 12 years. I'd been at her funeral, had thrown dirt on her coffin. But that was definitely her voice, the same slight accent, the same way she used to say my name when she was worried about me. "Carmen?" The word came out as barely a whisper. "Carmen, is that really you?" She smiled then, the same sad smile she used to give me when I was being stubborn about something. "You always were too kind for your own good, Hermana. Even when we were little, you'd stop to help herd animals, lost kids, anyone who needed it." I took a step toward her. Rain-slicked asphalt treacherous under my feet. "I don't understand. How are you here? What's happening?" "There was an accident here," she said. And as she spoke, I noticed that her lips weren't quite syncing with the words I was hearing. "October 15th, 1987. A young woman was driving north in weather just like this. She was going too fast, trying to get home to her family. She lost control right here, went through the barrier and down into the rocks." I looked around, suddenly aware of where I was standing. There was a gap in the rock face, a place where the cliff dropped away toward the ocean. In daylight, there might have been a guardrail, but in this darkness and rain, it was just empty space. "That woman," Carmen continued, "she had a sister who was a truck driver. A sister who taught her to always help people in need no matter what, even when it might be dangerous." The pieces started falling into place, and I felt cold in a way that had nothing to do with the weather. She stopped to help someone. She stopped to help someone who wasn't really there. Someone like me. Carmen's expression grew sadder. "Maria, you need to get back in your truck. You need to drive away from here right now." But I couldn't move. Everything felt like it was happening underwater, slow and dreamlike. "Are you trying to hurt me?" "No," she said, and she sounded like she was crying, though I couldn't see any tears on her face. "I'm trying to save you," just like I couldn't save her. That's when I heard the horn. It was loud, close, and coming from directly behind me. I spun around and saw headlights bearing down on my position, way too fast for the conditions. Another truck, a big rig that had to be doing 60 or 70 miles per hour, heading straight for where I was standing. I dove toward the shoulder, landed hard on the gravel, and felt the wind from the passing truck tear at my clothes. It missed me by maybe 3 feet, horn blaring as it disappeared into the rain and darkness. If I'd been standing where I was 10 seconds earlier, it would have killed me instantly. When I looked back toward where Carmen had been standing, she was gone. The temperature returned to normal, the sound of the storm came rushing back, and I was alone on the side of Highway 101 with a racing heart and scraped palms. I sat there in the rain for maybe 5 minutes trying to make sense of what had just happened. Finally, I got back in my truck, cranked up the heat, and tried to convince myself it had all been some kind of hallucination brought on by exhaustion and stress. But when I got to the next truck stop, about 40 miles south, I asked the clerk about that stretch of road. She looked at me funny for a minute, then went into the back office and came out with a yellowed newspaper clipping. "You're not the first driver to ask about that spot," she said. This was from October 16th, 1987. The headline read, "Local woman dies in Highway 101 crash." The article was short, just a few paragraphs, but it told the story Carmen had shared with me. Elena Vasquez, 24 years old, had been driving north on 101 during a severe storm when she lost control of her vehicle. She'd gone through a weak section of guardrail and down into the rocks below. The article mentioned that she'd been an incredibly kind person, always willing to help others, and that she'd left behind a sister who worked as a long-haul trucker. "Funny thing is," the clerk said, "every few years, usually during bad storms, we get drivers coming in here asking about that same stretch of road. They all describe seeing a woman in a white dress. And every single one of them says she saved their life. I kept that newspaper clipping, and I've read it probably 100 times since that night." Elena Vasquez died trying to help someone who wasn't really there, just like Carmen said. But now she's the one who isn't really there, standing on the side of that dangerous road, trying to keep other drivers from making the same mistake she did. I still drive Highway 101 sometimes when the money's good or when I'm feeling particularly brave. And sometimes, on foggy nights when the conditions are just right, I see her again. Always in the same white dress, always in the same spot. But I don't stop anymore. I just say a little prayer for Elena Vasquez and keep on driving. Because some people who are gone aren't really gone. They're just standing watch, making sure the rest of us make it home safe. Tommy Chen here, and I've been hauling freight through the Pacific Northwest for going on 15 years now. I've seen my share of weird stuff on these mountain roads. Weather that changes in minutes, rock slides that appear out of nowhere, wildlife doing things that don't make sense. But what happened to me on Interstate 84 through the Columbia River Gorge last spring was something else entirely. It was March 23rd, about 3:15 in the morning, and I was eastbound with a load of aerospace parts heading from Boeing in Seattle to a facility in Boise. I'd driven this route probably 200 times before. Knew every curve, every grade, every truck stop between the Columbia and the Snake River. The weather was clear for once, full moon making the canyon walls look like they were carved out of silver, and I was making good time. I just passed through the Dalles and was climbing up into the higher elevations when I first noticed the headlights in my mirrors. 2 white beams. Probably another truck by the spacing, maybe half a mile back and gaining on me slowly. Nothing unusual about that. Freight runs 24/7 and plenty of drivers prefer the night shift when traffic's lighter. I was running about 65 in a 70 zone, keeping pace with the grade and my load weight, when I noticed the headlights had gotten closer. Maybe a quarter mile back now, but not gaining as fast as they should have been if the driver was trying to pass. I moved over to the right lane to give him room, figuring he'd blow by me and disappear into the night like most drivers do. But he didn't pass. For the next 10 miles, those headlights stayed exactly the same distance behind me. Not gaining, not falling back, just maintaining that steady quarter-mile gap like we were connected by an invisible chain. I tried speeding up to 70, then 75 when the grade leveled out. The headlights stayed put. I tried slowing down to 60, then 55. Same thing. That's when I started getting annoyed. This kind of behavior on the highway is dangerous, especially in the mountains where you've got limited visibility and steep grades. So I grabbed my CB microphone and tried to raise the driver behind me. Eastbound big truck about mile marker 112. This is the blue Kenworth ahead of you. You got your ears on? Nothing but static. I tried again. Hey driver, you've been following me for the last 15 miles. If you're looking to pass, I'm in the right lane and you've got plenty of room. Still nothing. I switched to channel 19, the main trucker channel, and tried a general call. Any eastbound traffic on 84 through the gorge, this is Tommy in the blue KW. Got a driver behind me who's not responding to radio calls. Anyone else seeing this? A voice crackled back. Southern accent sounded like an older driver. Tommy, this is Big Jim in a white Peterbilt about 20 miles ahead of you. Been monitoring the channel and haven't heard any chatter from drivers in your area. You sure there's someone back there? I checked my mirrors again. The headlights were still there, still maintaining that exact same distance. Yeah, I'm sure. 2 headlights. Looks like a big rig. Been following me for the last 20 miles at least. Well, that's strange, Big Jim came back. I passed a few four-wheelers earlier, but I haven't seen hide nor hair of another truck since I left the Dolls. You might want to check your mirrors, son. Sometimes fatigue can play tricks on your eyes. I wasn't tired. I'd had a good night's sleep before starting this run, had been drinking coffee regularly and felt sharp as a tack. But I started to wonder if maybe I was seeing things. The mind can play tricks on you during long night drives, especially through monotonous terrain like the gorge. So I decided to test it. There was a long, straight stretch coming up where I could see for miles ahead and behind. Perfect place to see what was really going on. I gradually increased my speed to 80, then 85 miles per hour. Way faster than I should have been going with that load, but I needed to know if those headlights were real. They were, and they stayed exactly the same distance behind me. Now I was getting scared. No truck loaded heavily enough to be running the commercial routes could accelerate and maintain 85 miles per hour up a grade like that. The physics just don't work. Even if it was a light load or an empty trailer, the driver would have to be pushing his engine to dangerous RPMs to keep up that kind of speed uphill. I backed off to 70, then tried dropping down to 50. The headlights never wavered. Same distance, same position, like they were painted on my mirrors. By now I was approaching the exit for Cascade Locks, and I made a split-second decision. I took the off-ramp without signaling, tires squealing as I took the curve faster than I should have. If those headlights belonged to a real truck with a real driver, they'd have to react, either follow me off the interstate or continue eastbound. I watched my mirrors as I descended the ramp. The headlights slowed with me, took the same curve, followed me down toward the truck stop at the bottom of the hill. My hands were shaking on the steering wheel. The Cascade Locks truck stop is a good-sized facility with plenty of parking and 24-hour services. I pulled into the lot, found a spot under the lights near the fuel island, and grabbed my flashlight from the dash. If there was another truck following me, I was going to find out who was driving it and what the hell they thought they were doing. I climbed down from my cab and walked toward the entrance to the lot, flashlight in hand, looking for the vehicle with those headlights. The lot had maybe a dozen trucks parked for their mandatory rest periods, but none of them had their headlights on. I walked the entire perimeter of the lot, checked every single truck, looked behind buildings and dumpsters. Nothing. No truck that could have been following me. No fresh tire tracks in the gravel except for my own. No driver who looked like they'd just pulled in. I was the only person moving around the lot at that hour. I went into the truck stop and asked the night clerk if he'd seen another truck pull in right behind me. He looked at me like I was crazy. "You're the first truck we've had in here in over 2 hours," he said. "Been pretty quiet tonight." I bought a cup of coffee and sat in the driver's lounge for a while, trying to figure out what had just happened. Maybe Big Jim had been right. Maybe fatigue was playing tricks on my eyes, making me see things that weren't there. It was the only explanation that made any sense. But when I walked back out to my truck, I stopped dead in my tracks. There in the dust and road grime on my trailer were 2 parallel lines about 8 feet apart. The kind of lines you get when another vehicle follows too close behind you for too long, their headlight beams creating shadows in the dirt. I called my dispatcher from the truck stop and told him I needed to take my mandatory break right there instead of pushing on to Boise. Claimed I was feeling drowsy and wanted to be safe. He wasn't happy about the delay, but he approved it. I spent the rest of the night in my sleeper berth, but I didn't get much rest. Every time I started to drift off, I'd see those headlights in my imagination, always the exact same distance, never getting closer or farther away. When dawn broke, I felt better. Everything looks different in daylight, less threatening, more rational. I convinced myself that I'd experienced some kind of hallucination brought on by the monotony of night driving and maybe too much caffeine. It happens to drivers sometimes, especially on familiar routes where you can almost drive on autopilot. I finished my run to Boise without incident, delivered my load on time, and tried to put the whole experience behind me. But when I got back to Seattle, curiosity got the better of me. I went to the library and started researching accidents on I-84 through the Columbia River Gorge. What I found made my blood run cold. On March 23, 1995, exactly 28 years before my experience, a truck driver named David Morrison had jackknifed his rig on that same stretch of highway. According to the accident report, Morrison had been following another truck too closely in the early morning hours when the lead vehicle suddenly took the Cascade Locks exit without signaling. Morrison tried to follow, lost control on the off-ramp, and rolled his truck. He died at the scene. The report mentioned that Morrison's CB radio was found tuned to channel 19, microphone still in his hand, like he'd been trying to communicate with the truck ahead of him right up until the accident. But investigators never found the other driver. No one else reported being in the area at that time, and there were no other trucks at the Cascade Locks facility that morning. For 28 years, every March 23rd, David Morrison has been following that phantom truck down the Cascade Locks off-ramp, trying to find the driver who led him to his death. And this year, he followed me. I've driven I-84 probably 50 times since that night, but I always choose a different date, a different route, anything to avoid being on that highway on March 23rd. Because I know that somewhere out there in the darkness, David Morrison is still following headlights that aren't really there, still trying to make radio contact with a driver who can't hear him. And I don't ever want to be that driver again. Mostly short and medium hauls throughout Oregon and Washington. I got into trucking after my husband passed away, needed work that paid well and didn't require a college degree I couldn't afford. It's been a good life, mostly. The roads can be lonely, but they can also be peaceful, and I've always felt safer in my truck than I ever did working retail or office jobs. I've always been the type to help people when I can. Maybe it's how I was raised, or maybe it's because I know what it's like to need help and not have anyone to turn to. So when I see someone stranded on the side of the road, my first instinct is to stop and see if I can lend a hand. My dispatcher says it's dangerous, that I should call the authorities and let them handle it, but I can't drive past someone who might be in real trouble. That attitude is what got me into the situation I'm about to describe. It was November 8th, 2023, and I was driving east on Highway 26 toward Mount Hood with a load of restaurant equipment bound for a ski resort. The weather was typical for that time of year: cold, cloudy, with a light snow starting to fall as the elevation increased. Nothing too serious, just enough to make the road slippery and reduce visibility. I was about 20 miles east of Sandy, climbing into the higher elevations where the forest gets thick and the cell phone coverage gets spotty, when I saw the broken-down car. It was an old sedan, maybe from the 1970s, pulled off onto the shoulder with its hood up and emergency flashers blinking. Standing next to it was a man in a heavy winter coat, waving at passing traffic. Now, this stretch of Highway 26 doesn't get a lot of traffic, especially after dark in November. Most of the ski crowds won't start showing up for another month, and the locals know better than to drive vintage cars through mountain weather. But there he was, clearly needing help, and I couldn't just drive past. I pulled over about 50 yards ahead of the car, put on my own flashers, and grabbed a heavy jacket from behind my seat. The snow was coming down harder now, big wet flakes that melted on contact but were starting to stick to the trees and road edges. The man walked up to meet me, and right away I noticed something odd about him. His clothes looked old, not just used or worn, but old-fashioned. The coat was a style I remembered seeing in pictures from the 1970s, with wide lapels and a cut that went out of fashion decades ago. His hair was longer than most men wear it these days, and he had thick-framed glasses that looked like they belonged in a museum. "Thank you so much for stopping," he said, and his voice was polite, educated, with just a hint of an accent I couldn't place. "I seem to be having some trouble with my vehicle." "What's the problem?" I asked, walking over to look at the car. It was definitely from the 1970s, maybe a Ford or Chevrolet painted a faded blue that looked gray in the truck's headlights. The engine was an old V8, the kind they don't make anymore, and everything about it looked authentic to the period. "The engine just died on me," he said. "I was driving up to the lodge for a weekend of skiing, and it started making strange noises, then just quit. I'm afraid I don't know much about car repair. I'm no mechanic, but I've learned a few things over the years." I had him try to start it while I listened to the engine. It turned over fine but wouldn't catch, and I could smell flooded gas. Probably a carburetor problem, maybe something with the fuel line. Nothing I could fix on the side of the road with the tools I had. "I don't think I can get it running tonight," I told him, "but I can give you a ride to the next town. There's a garage and government camp that might be able to help you in the morning." His face lit up with gratitude. That would be wonderful. I hate to impose, but I don't have many options out here. He grabbed a small overnight bag from the car, and I noticed he didn't lock it or seem particularly concerned about leaving it on the side of the road. When I mentioned it, he just shrugged. "It's not worth much," he said. "And honestly, who's going to steal a broken-down car way out here?" We walked back to my truck, and I noticed he moved strangely, like he wasn't used to walking on uneven ground or in snow. When he climbed up into the passenger seat, he looked around the cab with obvious amazement. "These trucks are incredible," he said. "So much more sophisticated than they used to be, all these gauges and controls. It must be like flying an airplane." I laughed. "Not quite, but the technology has come a long way." "You haven't spent much time in big rigs?" "Not in modern ones," he said. "The last time I rode in a truck was, well, it was a long time ago." As we drove toward government camp, we talked about various things. He asked about my life, my work, how I'd gotten into trucking. I told him about losing my husband, about needing to start over, about finding independence and purpose on the road. He listened with the kind of attention that's rare these days, like my story was the most important thing in the world. In return, he told me about himself, though I noticed his stories had a strange, distant quality to them. He talked about working as a teacher, about loving the mountains, about coming up to ski every winter since he was young. But when I asked him about his school or his family, his answers were vague, almost dreamlike. Time has a way of changing things, he said when I pressed him for details. Sometimes I feel like the world I knew is gone, replaced by something I don't quite recognize. That's when I started noticing other odd things. The heater in my truck was running full blast, but he didn't seem warm. He never took off his heavy coat, never loosened his scarf, even though I was getting uncomfortably hot. And when I offered him coffee from my thermos, he declined, saying he didn't drink it anymore. Anymore? I asked. He was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the snow-covered trees. I gave up a lot of things, he finally said. After the accident. What accident? But he didn't answer, just kept staring out the window like he was seeing something I couldn't. We were about 5 miles from government camp when he started talking about the road. Not the current road, but the way it used to be. He described curves that had been straightened, hills that had been flattened, whole sections that had been rerouted decades ago. He talked about a bridge that had been replaced, a scenic overlook that no longer existed, a gas station that had been torn down in the 1980s. How do you know all this? I asked. You'd have to have been driving this road for 40 years to remember all those changes. He smiled sadly. I've been driving this road for a very long time. That's when it hit me. All the little things that had been bothering me suddenly made sense. The old-fashioned clothes, the vintage car, the way he talked about the past like it was yesterday and the present like it was foreign. The fact that he wasn't affected by the heat in my cab. I pulled over at the next wide spot in the road and turned to look at him directly. What year do you think it is? He stared at me for a long moment, confusion flickering across his face. It's 1978, he said. November 8th, 1978. I was driving up to Timberline Lodge for opening weekend. My hands started shaking on the steering wheel. Sir, it's 2023, November 8th, 2023. The confusion in his expression deepened, then slowly gave way to something like recognition. That's not possible, he said, but his voice was uncertain now. I was driving up the mountain and my car broke down. That was today, that was... He trailed off, staring at his hands like he'd never seen them before. What's your name? I asked quietly. Michael, he said. Michael Patterson. I taught high school history in Portland. I was supposed to meet friends at the lodge this weekend. I already knew what I was going to find, but I had to ask. Michael, what's the last thing you remember before your car broke down? His face went pale. There was another car, he said slowly, coming down the mountain too fast. The driver was probably drunk or maybe just young and stupid. I tried to avoid them, but the road was icy and... He looked up at me with eyes full of dawning horror. I went off the road, didn't I? Down into the ravine. That's why it's so cold. That's why. I reached over to put a comforting hand on his shoulder, but my hand passed right through him. He was fading, becoming translucent like morning fog touched by sunlight. I'm dead, he said, wonder and sadness mixing in his voice. I've been dead for 45 years. Michael, I said, tears starting to flow down my cheeks. I'm so sorry. He smiled then, the same sad smile he'd worn when talking about the past. Don't be sorry. You gave me something I've been looking for all this time. What's that? Someone to talk to. Someone who listened to my story. He was barely visible now, just an outline in the passenger seat. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you for stopping. And then he was gone. The passenger seat was empty, still warm from the heater, but showing no sign that anyone had been sitting there. The door hadn't opened. He hadn't gotten out. He'd simply disappeared like he'd never been there at all. I sat there for a long time, engine running, snow falling harder outside my windshield. Eventually, I put the truck back in gear and drove to government camp, where I stopped at a 24-hour diner and asked the waitress about local history. "Oh, you must mean the Patterson accident," she said when I described what Michael had told me. "That happened way before my time, but everybody around here knows the story. Young teacher from Portland came up here for a ski weekend in 1978. Some drunk driver forced him off the road up near milepost 45. Car went down into the ravine, took them 3 days to find the body. Real tragedy." "Does anyone ever see him?" I asked. She gave me a knowing look. "You're not the first trucker to ask about that stretch of road. Every few years, someone comes in here with a story about picking up a hitchhiker who talks about the old days. Always the same description. Young guy, teacher, says his car broke down, and he always disappears before they get to town." I finished my coffee and got back on the road, but I drove past the spot where I'd picked up Michael. His car was gone. No broken-down sedan, no emergency flashers, no sign that anyone had ever been there except for the tire tracks from my truck. But I know he was real. I know I gave a lonely soul a few miles of human contact, a chance to tell his story to someone who would listen. And maybe that's all he needed, not to be rescued, but to be remembered, to know that 45 years after his death, someone still cared enough to stop. I drive Highway 26 regularly now, and I always slow down when I pass that spot. I keep hoping I'll see him again. Keep hoping I can give Michael Patterson another chance to talk about his life, his dreams, his love for these mountains that became his final resting place. Because some people don't need to be saved. They just need to know they're not forgotten. Story 4, Radio Static in the Olympic Mountains. Marcus Thompson here, and I want to start by saying I've always been a practical man. 22 years driving truck, mostly specialized loads to remote locations where other drivers won't go. And I've built my reputation on reliability, safety, and getting the job done no matter what the conditions. I don't drink, don't do drugs, and I sure as hell don't believe in ghosts or supernatural nonsense. At least I didn't until what happened in the Olympic Mountains last February. I run high-end communication equipment in my rig, CB radio with extra power, long-range antenna array, even a ham radio setup for emergencies. Communication is critical when you're hauling oversized loads through terrain where cell phones don't work and help might be hours away. I maintain all my equipment myself, test it regularly, and I know the difference between equipment malfunction and something that can't be explained. The job that brought me to the Olympics was a generator delivery to a remote research station on the western side of the peninsula. Big industrial unit, the kind that keeps critical systems running when the power goes out. The road was barely maintained, more of a logging track than a highway, winding through old-growth forest so thick you can't see the sky even in broad daylight. It was February 18th, about 2:30 in the afternoon, though it might as well have been midnight under that canopy of trees. I was about 30 miles from the nearest town, following GPS coordinates that led deeper and deeper into wilderness that felt untouched by civilization. The kind of place where you understand why people believe in Sasquatch and other legends. If something wanted to stay hidden out there, it could stay hidden forever. My CB had been picking up the usual chatter for the first part of the drive. Truckers on I-5 talking about traffic conditions, weather reports, complaints about fuel prices. But as I got deeper into the mountains, the voices faded to static, then silence. Normal enough for that terrain. Radio waves don't penetrate heavy forest canopy very well, especially in mountainous areas. I was navigating a particularly tricky switchback, generator load making my trailer swing wide on the narrow road when my radio suddenly crackled to life. clear as day, cutting through the static like it was broadcasting from right next to me. Unit 47, this is base. What's your 20? Over? I reached for the microphone, thinking maybe I'd stumbled into range of some forestry service or research station frequency. But before I could respond, another voice came through. Base, this is Unit 47. We're about 2 miles up the old logging road, but we've got a problem. Road's washed out ahead and there's no way around. We're going to need equipment to clear it. Over. The voices were crystal clear, professional, like experienced drivers talking to their dispatch. But something about them bothered me. The terminology was slightly off. Unit 47 instead of using a truck number or driver name. The old logging road when there were dozens of old logging roads in these mountains. Unit 47 understood. What's the extent of the washout? Can you get through on foot? Over. Negative, base. It's a complete slide, took out maybe 50 yards of roadway. We've got injured people here, need medical assistance and heavy equipment. This is bad. Over. Injured people. That got my attention fast. I grabbed my microphone and tried to break into their conversation. Unknown stations, this is Marcus in a commercial vehicle on Forest Service Road. Hell, I don't even know the number. I'm hearing traffic about injured people. Do you need assistance? Over. Static, nothing but static for about 30 seconds, then the original voices resumed like I'd never spoken. Base, how long until we get help out here? We've got men trapped under equipment and one of them doesn't look good. Over. Unit 47, we're mobilizing everything we can, but it's going to take time. Weather's working against us, hang tight. Over. I tried again. Emergency traffic, this is Marcus Thompson in a Freightliner on Olympic Peninsula Forest Roads. I have medical supplies and can assist with rescue operations. Please respond with your location. Over. Again, nothing. Like they couldn't hear me at all. That's when I started paying closer attention to what they were saying. The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, and the more I listened, the more details bothered me. They mentioned equipment I hadn't seen in years. Old models of bulldozers and logging trucks that went out of service in the 1980s. They talked about getting word to families back in town without mentioning any specific town name. And there was something about the way they spoke, the cadence and terminology that felt dated. But it was the weather references that really got to me. They kept mentioning snow, heavy snow that was hampering rescue efforts. February in the Olympics usually means rain, not snow, at least not at the elevation I was traveling. And it was a clear, cold day. No precipitation at all. The conversation ended abruptly with Unit 47 saying they were going to try to reach higher ground to get better radio reception. Then my radio went silent again, just the usual static and distant fragments of commercial traffic. I kept driving, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The voices had been so clear, so immediate, that they had to be coming from somewhere nearby. If there really was an accident with injured people, I had an obligation to help if I could. About 5 miles further up the road, I came to a wide spot where I could safely turn around if needed. I stopped the truck, got out my topographic maps, and tried to figure out exactly where I was. That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. According to the map, I was traveling on a road that had been built in 1995, replacing an older logging road that had been abandoned after a major landslide. The old road was marked on the map with a dotted line and a notation. Road closed 1983. Landslide with fatalities. I dug out my smartphone, praying I had enough signal to get online, and managed to connect long enough to do some research. What I found confirmed my worst fears. On February 18, 1983, exactly 40 years ago to the day, a logging crew had been working on a road improvement project when a massive landslide buried their equipment and trapped several men. The rescue operation had been hampered by heavy snow in the remote location. 3 men died, and it took 2 days to recover their bodies. The radio communications I'd been hearing were from that rescue operation. 40-year-old emergency traffic, somehow still broadcasting in these mountains on the anniversary of the accident. I sat in my truck for a long time, studying the map and trying to make sense of what I'd experienced. The old road would have run roughly parallel to the one I was on, maybe a quarter mile to the north through thicker forest. If the landslide had been as massive as the news report suggested, it would have completely blocked the road and buried everything under tons of rock and timber. That's when I remembered something my father used to tell me. He'd worked logging in these same mountains back in the 1970s and early 80s. And he'd always said the Olympics held on to things. Sounds, voices, memories. Sound carries different in old forests, he used to say. Sometimes it carries longer than it should. My father had been part of that rescue operation. I remembered him coming home after 3 days, dirty and exhausted and sadder than I'd ever seen him. He'd known the men who died, had worked alongside them for years. He never talked about the details, but I'd overheard him telling my mother that the radio chatter had been heartbreaking, listening to trapped men calling for help that came too late. Now I was hearing those same calls, 40 years later, on the same date, in the same place where my father had fought desperately to save his friends. I started up my truck and continued toward the research station, but I kept the radio on, hoping to hear more. The voices never returned. I delivered the generator without incident, but on the drive back out of the mountains, I stopped at the wide spot where I'd looked at the maps. I got out of my truck, walked to the edge of the road, and looked north into the forest. Through the trees, I could just make out what looked like an old roadbed, overgrown with 40 years of vegetation, but still visible if you knew what to look for. Somewhere in that tangle of forest and undergrowth, 3 men had died trying to build something lasting in an unforgiving landscape. I stood there for maybe 10 minutes, listening to the wind in the trees, the distant sound of water running over rocks, the small sounds of a forest going about its business. And just before I turned to leave, I thought I heard something else. The faint sound of men calling to each other, coordinating a rescue effort that would never succeed. "This is for you, Dad," I said quietly, "and for the men you couldn't save." I don't know if voices can linger in a place trapped by tragedy and strong emotion, but I know what I heard that day. I know those men are still out there, still calling for help, still hoping someone will hear them and respond, and maybe in a way someone finally did. I've driven through the Olympics dozens of times since then, but I always monitor the radio when I'm in that area, especially around February 18th. Not because I want to hear those voices again, they carry too much pain, too much desperation, but because I want them to know someone is listening. Someone remembers what happened on that mountain 40 years ago. Because some calls for help echo longer than they should, and someone needs to be there to hear them. Robert Big Bob Johnson speaking, and I've been driving commercially for 26 years now, most of it through the Pacific Northwest. I've hauled everything from lumber to electronics, driven in every kind of weather these mountains can throw at you, and I've always prided myself on keeping my equipment in perfect condition. Preventive maintenance, regular inspections, quality parts. I don't believe in taking chances when you're piloting 80,000 pounds of truck and trailer down mountain highways. So when I tell you about what happened on the Kalama River Bridge last September, understand that mechanical failure was not an option. My 2019 Peterbilt had been serviced 2 days earlier, everything checked and double-checked. Engine was running perfect, electrical system solid, fuel system clean. I keep maintenance logs that would impress DOT inspectors, and I can spot potential problems before they become real problems. The bridge I'm talking about spans the Kalama River on Highway 503 about halfway between Woodland and Mount St. Helens. It's not a particularly impressive bridge, maybe 400 feet long, steel and concrete construction, built in the 1960s to replace an older wooden span. During the day, it's just another piece of infrastructure you barely notice. But at night, especially on foggy nights like September 15, 2023, it can feel isolated and somehow ominous. I was running empty, heading north after delivering a load of construction equipment to a job site near the mountain. It was about 11:30 p.m. and fog was rolling in from the river, thick enough to cut visibility down to maybe 100 feet. I'd slowed to 45 miles per hour, hazard lights flashing, being extra cautious because that stretch of road is narrow and has no shoulders to speak of. I'd driven that route probably 50 times before, knew every curve and grade. As I approached the bridge, I could see the lights marking the beginning of the span, yellow reflectors that helped guide vehicles across in low visibility conditions. Everything was normal. Engine running smooth, all systems green, plenty of fuel. Then about halfway across the bridge, my engine started to lose power. It wasn't a sudden failure, more like someone was gradually turning down the throttle. My RPMs dropped from 1800 to 1500, then to 1200, even though my foot was steady on the accelerator. I pressed harder, but the engine didn't respond. The power steering got heavy. The air brakes started hissing as the compressor struggled to maintain pressure. By the time I reached the center of the bridge, my engine was barely idling. I managed to guide my rig to a stop right at the highest point of the span, emergency flashers on, hoping another vehicle wouldn't rear-end me in the fog. I tried revving the engine, but it wouldn't respond. All my gauges showed normal readings. Oil pressure good, coolant temperature fine, electrical system charging properly. By every measurement I had, the engine should have been running perfectly. Then the temperature dropped. I'm not talking about a gradual cooling as night settled in. I'm talking about an instant dramatic temperature drop that turned my breath to fog inside the heated cab. The windows started icing over from the inside, which should have been impossible with the defroster running and outside temperatures in the 40s. That's when I noticed the silence. Not just the absence of engine noise that I expected, but the complete absence of all sound. No wind, no water flowing under the bridge, no distant traffic. It was like someone had wrapped the entire bridge in soundproof material. I tried restarting the engine. The starter engaged, turned the engine over perfectly, but it wouldn't catch. Not even a sputter or cough, just the mechanical sound of pistons cycling without ignition. I tried again, holding the key longer, pumping the accelerator. Nothing. I grabbed my CB microphone to call for help, but the radio was dead. Not just receiving static, completely dead, like someone had unplugged it. I checked the connections, tried different channels, even switched to my backup radio. Both units were getting power from the electrical system, but neither would transmit or receive. That's when I started getting scared. Not because of the mechanical problems. I've dealt with breakdowns before, and this stretch of highway gets enough traffic that someone would stop to help eventually. But because nothing about this situation made sense. Engines don't just stop running when all systems are normal. Radios don't fail simultaneously without cause, and temperatures don't drop 30 degrees in 30 seconds. I climbed down from the cab to check under the hood, flashlight in hand. The fog was so thick I could barely see the front of my truck, and it seemed to be getting thicker. But what really bothered me was the color of the fog. Instead of the normal gray-white you expect from river mist, this fog had a strange yellowish tint, like it was illuminated from within. I popped the hood and checked everything I could see. Engine looked fine, all connections tight, no obvious leaks or damage, but when I touched the engine block, it was stone cold. Not just cool from sitting idle, but cold like it had been shut off for hours. That was impossible. The engine had been running normally just minutes earlier. I was standing there trying to figure out what to do next when I heard the voices. They were faint at first, almost lost in the unnatural silence that surrounded the bridge. But as I listened, they got clearer. Men's voices, maybe 3 or 4 of them, talking in urgent tones about something I couldn't quite make out. "Get that line secured," one of them shouted, and his voice echoed strangely in the fog. "Water's rising fast," another replied. "We need to get everyone off the bridge." I walked toward the sound, flashlight beam disappearing into the yellow fog after just a few feet. The voices seemed to be coming from below the bridge, down near the water level. "Can anyone see the truck? How many people were in it?" "At least 2, maybe more. But the current's too strong, we can't get close enough." My blood went cold. They were talking about a truck, about people in the water, about a rescue operation. I ran to the bridge railing and shined my flashlight down toward the river, but all I could see was fog and darkness. "Hello," I shouted. "I'm up on the bridge. Do you need help?" The voices stopped immediately. Complete silence for maybe 30 seconds, then one voice, much closer than the others. "Who's there?" "We can't see you in this fog." "I'm on the bridge. I've got a truck broken down up here. Are you conducting some kind of rescue operation?" Again, silence. Then a different voice, older, more authoritative. "Son, you need to get off that bridge right now. It's not safe. There's been an accident." "What kind of accident?" "I can help. I've got emergency equipment in my truck." "You can't help them," the voice said. And now it sounded sad, defeated. "They've been in the water too long. We're just recovering bodies now." I felt sick. Some kind of accident had happened, people had drowned, and I was stuck on the bridge with a broken-down truck while rescue workers tried to recover victims from the river below. "How long ago did it happen?" I called down. "About an hour," the voice replied. "Truck went through the railing in the fog just like yours almost did. Driver must have gotten disoriented, hit the barrier at the wrong angle." I looked around frantically. My truck was sitting squarely in the center of the bridge, nowhere near the railing. I hadn't come close to hitting anything. "I don't understand," I said. "My truck didn't go through any railing. I'm still on the bridge." Silence. Long, complete silence that stretched on for several minutes. Then, very faintly, almost like a whisper, "So were they." That's when my truck engine roared to life. Not the gradual startup you'd expect from a cold engine, but an instant full-power roar like someone had just turned a key in a perfectly warmed-up vehicle. All my electrical systems came back online, the radio crackled with normal traffic chatter, and the temperature in my cab returned to normal. The fog began to clear, rolling away from the bridge like someone was pulling back a curtain. Within minutes, I could see the river below, the road ahead and behind me, the normal nighttime landscape of the Kalama Valley. I didn't wait around to investigate further. I put my truck in gear and got off that bridge as fast as I safely could. But as I reached the far end of the span, I looked back and saw something that made me pull over and check my logbook. According to my clock, I'd been on the bridge for exactly 10 minutes. But according to my engine hour meter, the truck had been running continuously. No gap, no period of shutdown. As far as my truck was concerned, we'd never stopped at all. The next day, I called the local sheriff's department and asked about accidents on the Kalama River Bridge. The deputy I spoke to got quiet for a long moment, then asked me to describe exactly what had happened. After I finished my story, he sighed. "You're not the first driver to report problems on that bridge," he said. "Happens maybe once or twice a year, always in heavy fog, always at night. Trucks stall out, radios go dead, drivers hear voices from rescue operations that happened decades ago. Decades ago, November 15th, 1960. Logging truck lost control in heavy fog, went through the old wooden railing into the river. 2 men died, the driver and a passenger. Rescue operation went on for hours, but they never found the bodies until spring when the water level dropped. November 15th, 1960. Almost exactly 63 years before my experience. The thing is, the deputy continued, we get reports like yours pretty regularly, but they're always on the anniversary of the accident. November 15th every year. Except you said this happened in September. I double-checked my logbook, my delivery receipts, even my truck's GPS log. September 15th, 2023. No mistake. But when I got home and looked at a calendar more carefully, I realized what had happened. September 15th, 2023 fell on exactly the same day of the week as November 15th, 1960. A Friday night, fog rolling in from the river, a truck crossing the bridge at almost the exact same time. I've crossed that bridge dozens of times since then in all kinds of weather, and I've never had another problem, but I always slow down when I reach the center span, and I always listen carefully to my radio. Because sometimes on foggy Friday nights, you can still hear the voices of men trying desperately to save 2 lives that had already been lost. The bridge where engines die isn't really about mechanical failure. It's about the moment when people realized they couldn't save everyone, couldn't undo what had been done, couldn't bring back what the river had taken. And sometimes, on the anniversary of that realization, the bridge remembers. And I want to start by saying that I've been driving nights for 12 years now, ever since my kids were small and I needed work that would let me be home during the day. Night driving is different from day driving. Quieter, lonelier, but also more peaceful in its own way. You get used to the solitude, the long stretches of empty highway, the way your headlights create a bubble of light moving through darkness. What you don't get used to is seeing things that shouldn't be there. January 9th, 2024, I was running eastbound on I-90 through Snoqualmie Pass with a load of electronics bound for Spokane. It was about 2:45 a.m. and conditions were typical for winter in the Cascades. Heavy fog, temperature just above freezing. That kind of thick mist that makes everything look like you're driving through a cloud. Visibility was maybe 50 feet, so I had my speed down to 35 miles per hour, hazards flashing, following the center line like it was a lifeline. I'd been fighting these conditions for about an hour when I first saw them in my mirrors. Headlights maybe a quarter-mile back, keeping pace with me through the fog. At first I thought it was just another truck taking the same cautious approach to the dangerous conditions. Safety in numbers, you know. If someone's following your lights, you're both less likely to miss important signs or obstacles. But as the miles passed, I started noticing things that didn't add up. The headlights never got closer or farther away, maintaining that exact same distance like they were connected to my truck by an invisible chain. More strange, I couldn't see any running lights or marker lights that would indicate what kind of vehicle was following me. Just 2 white headlight beams cutting through the fog. I tried raising them on the CB radio. Eastbound traffic following my lights through the pass. This is Jennifer in the red Freightliner. You got your ears on? Nothing but static. I tried channel 19, the main trucking channel. Any eastbound drivers on I-90 near milepost 47, this is the red Freightliner running slow in the fog, looking to make contact with the vehicle behind me. Still nothing, but the headlights stayed put, following me like a faithful dog. About 10 miles later, the fog started to thin slightly, and that's when I saw them clearly for the first time. Not just one vehicle, but a whole convoy. 5, maybe 6 trucks running in perfect formation, each one maintaining exactly the same spacing, all moving at exactly the same speed. Their headlights were perfectly aligned, like they were connected by rigid bars instead of following independently. That's when I noticed how old the trucks looked. Even in the limited visibility, I could make out enough detail to see that these weren't modern rigs. The headlights were round instead of rectangular, the grills were chrome instead of painted plastic, and the overall proportions looked like trucks from the 1960s or 70s. Classic long-nosed Peterbilts and Kenworths, the kind you see at truck shows, not on modern highways hauling commercial freight. I grabbed my CB microphone again. Eastbound convoy behind me on I-90. This is Jennifer in the Freightliner. That's some beautiful vintage iron you're running there. You headed to a show? Static, complete silence from the radio, even though I could see the trucks clearly now. Close enough that their drivers should have been able to hear my transmission. I tried different channels, broadcast on the emergency frequency, even switched to my backup radio. Nothing. It was like they were ghosts, visible but unreachable. But they weren't behaving like ghosts. When I slowed down, they slowed down. When I speeded up slightly as the fog cleared, they matched my pace exactly. When I moved to the left lane to pass a slower-moving vehicle, the entire convoy moved with me, maintaining their formation like a well-trained military unit. The fog was lifting enough now that I could see more details, and that's when I really started to get scared. The lead truck, a beautiful 1960s-era Peterbilt with a long hood and chrome everywhere, was close enough that I should have been able to see the driver. But the cab looked empty. Not just dark, empty, like there was no one behind the wheel. I focused on the other trucks in the convoy, trying to spot a human figure in any of them. Same thing. Pristine vintage trucks, running lights glowing, engines obviously running smooth and strong, but no visible drivers. That's impossible, of course. Trucks don't drive themselves, especially not trucks from 50 years ago that predate any kind of automated systems. But that's exactly what I was seeing. A convoy of driverless trucks following me through the Cascade Mountains in the middle of a foggy night. I decided to test them. There was a rest area coming up in about 2 miles, and I put on my turn signal well in advance, making it clear I was going to exit the highway. The convoy immediately put on their turn signals too, all of them blinking in perfect synchronization. I pulled into the rest area, which was completely empty except for a few cars in the far parking spaces. The convoy followed me in, but instead of spreading out to individual parking spots like normal trucks, they maintained their tight formation, parking in a neat line maybe 50 yards from where I stopped. I sat in my cab for a few minutes waiting to see if any drivers would get out of the trucks. Nothing. The engines kept running, the running lights stayed on, but no one emerged from any of the vehicles. It was like looking at a display in a museum. Perfect trucks preserved in time, but lacking the human element that makes them real. Finally, I grabbed my flashlight and climbed down from my cab. The fog was still thick enough that I couldn't see the trucks clearly until I got within 20 feet of them. But what I saw when I got close was both beautiful and terrifying. The lead truck was a 1969 Peterbilt 359. Painted in a gorgeous deep blue with hand-applied pinstriping that must have taken weeks to complete. The chrome work was flawless, and the truck looked like it had just rolled off the assembly line despite being over 50 years old. But when I shined my flashlight through the side window, the cab was completely empty. Not just no driver, no seats, no steering wheel, no dashboard. Just an empty shell. I moved down the line, checking each truck. Same story. Beautiful, perfectly maintained vintage rigs that looked like they'd been restored by master craftsmen, but completely hollow inside. No interiors, no drivers, no signs that anyone had ever actually operated these vehicles. I was standing next to the last truck in the convoy, a pristine 1971 Kenworth W900, when I heard the voices. They were faint, muffled by the fog, but clearly human voices having a conversation. I couldn't make out individual words, but I could hear the cadence and rhythm of people talking, maybe sharing a meal or taking a break from driving. Hello? I called out. Is someone there? I'm a driver, just trying to figure out what's going on here. The voices stopped immediately. Complete silence for maybe 30 seconds, then I heard footsteps on gravel like someone walking toward me through the fog. I aimed my flashlight in the direction of the sound, but the beam disappeared into the mist after just a few feet. The footsteps got closer, deliberate and steady, but I couldn't see anyone. I'm not going to hurt you, I said, though my voice was shaking. I'm just confused about these trucks. Are you part of this convoy? The footsteps stopped maybe 10 feet away from me. Then a voice, clear and kind, spoke from the fog. You shouldn't be here, miss. This isn't a safe place for a lone driver. Why not? It's just a rest area. I've stopped here dozens of times. Not during the storm, the voice said. Not when the road gets dangerous. That's when we come out to help. Help with what? Drivers who get lost in the fog. Drivers who slide off the road or get confused by the conditions. We guide them to safety. I thought about the way the convoy had followed me, maintaining perfect formation, matching my speed. Exactly, you were guiding me. The pass is treacherous in weather like this, the voice said. Easy to miss a curve, hit a barrier, go off the road. We make sure people get through safely. But your trucks... I looked inside them. They're empty. A long pause, then sadly, we've been empty for a long time. January 9th, 1969. Whiteout conditions worse than tonight. We were running together for safety, 5 trucks in convoy when the storm hit. Ice on the road, wind pushing us around, visibility down to nothing. My blood went cold. January 9th, 1969. Exactly 55 years ago. What happened? I asked, though I was pretty sure I already knew. Lead truck missed a curve, went through the guardrail and down into the canyon. Rest of us tried to stop, but the ice. We all went over. 5 trucks, 5 drivers, 5 families that never got to say goodbye. I stood there in the fog, flashlight beam wavering in my trembling hand, talking to a man who had died decades before I was born. I'm sorry, I whispered. I'm so sorry. Don't be sorry, he said, and his voice was gentle. We found purpose in this. Every year on the anniversary, we come back to help other drivers get through safely, make sure what happened to us doesn't happen to anyone else. How many people have you helped? Hundreds, maybe thousands over the years. Drivers who were going too fast, who couldn't see the road, who were about to make the same mistakes we did. We show them the safe speed, the safe path. We make sure they get home to their families. I realized that's exactly what they'd done for me. I'd been driving too fast for the conditions when I first spotted them, probably 15 or 20 miles per hour faster than was safe. But following their lead, matching their cautious pace, I'd made it through the most dangerous part of the pass without incident. Thank you, I said. Thank you for keeping me safe. It's what we do, the voice replied. It's all we can do. I heard the footsteps again, moving away through the fog. Wait, I called. Will I see you again? Not unless you need us, the voice said, fainter now, distant. And we hope you never need us. When I looked back toward the convoy, the trucks were gone. Not driving away, just gone, like they'd never been there at all. The only sign they'd ever existed was the faint smell of diesel exhaust in the air and the memory of their guidance through the dangerous mountain pass. I got back in my truck and continued east, toward Spokane. But I drove carefully, remembering the lessons the convoy had taught me about respecting the mountains and the weather. I made it through the rest of the pass without incident, delivered my load on time, and tried to process what had happened. When I got home, I researched the accident the voice had described. January 9th, 1969, 5 trucks in convoy had indeed gone off I-90 in Snoqualmie Pass during severe weather conditions. 5 drivers died, and it took 3 days to recover all the vehicles from the canyon. The accident had led to improved safety measures, better guardrails, and new protocols for closing the pass during dangerous conditions. But every year on the anniversary of the accident, drivers report seeing a convoy of vintage trucks that helps guide them safely through treacherous weather. Always the same description: 5 or 6 trucks in perfect formation, always maintaining safe speeds, always disappearing once the danger has passed. I've driven through Snoqualmie Pass hundreds of times since that night, but I've never seen the convoy again. And I hope I never do, because seeing them means the conditions are dangerous enough that drivers are at risk of sharing their fate. But I know they're out there watching over the pass, ready to help when someone needs guidance through the fog and ice. 5 drivers who gave their lives to the mountain, now spending eternity making sure other drivers don't have to do the same. Some guardian angels wear hard hats and drive 18-wheelers. Dave Peterson speaking, and I've been specializing in Forest Service deliveries for 8 years now. It's a niche market, hauling equipment and supplies to remote ranger stations, research facilities, and fire camps deep in the Olympic and Cascade Mountains. The money's good because most drivers won't take the contracts. The roads are rough, GPS doesn't work half the time, and you're often driving alone through wilderness where help is hours away if something goes wrong. I like the solitude, though. After 20 years of dealing with urban traffic and crowded truck stops, there's something peaceful about driving through old-growth forest on roads that haven't changed much since they were first carved out by loggers decades ago. You see wildlife, breathtaking views, and places that most people never get to experience. But sometimes in those remote places, you also experience things that shouldn't be possible. March 3, 2024, I was delivering scientific equipment to a climate research station deep in the Olympic National Forest. The facility was about 40 miles off the main highway, accessible only by a series of increasingly narrow logging roads that wound through some of the most pristine wilderness left in the continental United States. I'd made the delivery before, knew the route by heart, and wasn't expecting any problems. The first 30 miles went normally. The road was rough but passable, winding through dense forest that filtered the afternoon sunlight into green-tinted shadows. My GPS lost signal about 15 miles in, which was standard for that area, so I was navigating by memory and the occasional Forest Service sign. It was when I turned onto the final access road that things started getting strange. This was supposed to be a 10-mile stretch that would take me directly to the research station, a route I'd driven at least a dozen times before. But something felt different right from the start. The road looked the same. Narrow dirt and gravel, carved between massive Douglas firs and western hemlocks that had been growing since before Europeans arrived in North America. But the landmarks weren't where they should have been. A distinctive split-rail fence that should have appeared after the first mile was nowhere to be seen. A small creek crossing that I remembered clearly was missing. The mile markers that the Forest Service had installed 2 years earlier were gone. At first I figured they'd done some maintenance work, maybe rerouted parts of the road to avoid erosion or protect sensitive habitat. Government agencies are always making changes without updating their maps or notifying contractors. So I kept driving, confident that I'd eventually recognize something and get back on the right track. But after what should have been 10 miles, I still hadn't seen anything familiar. The road kept winding through identical forest, past the same types of trees, around the same kinds of curves. I checked my odometer. I'd driven exactly 10 miles since turning onto what I thought was the access road, but there was no research station, no buildings, no sign that I was anywhere near my destination. I pulled over at a wide spot and checked my paperwork. The directions were clear. Turn left at Forest Service marker 47, follow the road for 10.2 miles, research station will be on the right. I distinctly remembered seeing marker 47 and making the turn, but somehow I'd ended up... where? The road I was on looked exactly like the access road I'd traveled many times before, but it was leading nowhere. I decided to backtrack. Maybe I'd missed a turn, gotten confused by similar-looking intersections. It happens in dense forest where every mile looks like every other mile. I turned my rig around, careful not to get stuck in the soft shoulder, and headed back the way I'd come. 10 miles later, I should have reached the main logging road where I'd made my turn. Instead, I found myself at another intersection that looked exactly like the one I'd just left. Same wide spot for turning around, same arrangement of trees, same everything. According to my odometer, I'd driven exactly 10 miles, but I was back where I'd started. That's when I started getting worried. I've been driving professionally for over 2 decades, and I've never gotten turned around badly enough to end up driving in circles. I'm careful about navigation, keep detailed logs, and I pay attention to landmarks. But somehow I'd managed to drive 20 miles and end up exactly where I'd begun. I tried again, this time paying closer attention to everything I passed. I memorized specific trees, unique rock formations, anything that would help me track my progress. A lightning-struck cedar about 2 miles in. A small waterfall visible through the trees at mile 4. An old concrete culvert at mile 7. 10 miles later, I passed the same lightning-struck cedar, the same waterfall, the same culvert, same order, same distances, like I was driving through some kind of supernatural replay of the same stretch of road. My fuel gauge should have been dropping. I'd driven 40 miles on roads that require low gears and frequent acceleration, the kind of driving that burns fuel fast. But the needle hadn't moved. According to my instruments, I hadn't used any fuel at all. The clock on my dashboard showed 4:15 p.m., the same time it had shown when I first noticed something was wrong. I'd been driving for what felt like hours, but time had apparently stopped moving. I tried my CB radio, hoping to reach another driver or maybe a forest service station. Nothing but static. My cell phone showed no signal, which was normal for that area, but when I checked the GPS function, it couldn't find any satellites. Not low signal or poor reception. It acted like GPS satellites didn't exist. That's when I realized I might be in serious trouble. If I was somehow trapped on this road driving the same 10-mile loop over and over, I could run out of fuel eventually, or food and water. The research station was expecting their delivery, but if I couldn't reach them, they'd eventually send someone to look for me. But how would they find me if I wasn't really on any mapped road? I tried a different approach. Instead of turning around at the 10-mile point, I kept driving straight, hoping the road would eventually lead somewhere new. But after another mile, the road simply ended. Not at a gate or barrier, not at another intersection. It just stopped, like someone had erased the rest of it from existence. Trees grew right up to where the road surface ended, as if the road had never extended any farther. When I backed up and checked my odometer, I was back at the 10-mile mark. The road that had ended just moments before was now continuing ahead of me, looking exactly like it had during my previous loops. I sat in my truck for a long time, engine idling, trying to make sense of what was happening. The logical part of my mind insisted that I was just confused, disoriented by the monotonous forest scenery and similar-looking roads. But the evidence was undeniable. I was trapped in some kind of loop, driving the same 10 miles of road over and over, unable to escape or reach my destination. That's when I remembered something my grandfather had told me years ago. He'd been a logger in these same forests back in the 1940s and 50s, and he used to tell stories about places in the deep woods where strange things happened. The forests don't like to be mapped, he'd say. Some places it'll let you find them once, but if you try to go back, they hide from you. And some places they hold on to you, won't let you leave. He'd told me about loggers who'd gotten lost on roads they'd traveled dozens of times. Equipment that would disappear overnight from secure camps. and areas where compasses spun wildly and couldn't find true north. He'd always insisted that the forest was alive in ways that modern people didn't understand, and that it had its own rules about who could go where. At the time, I'd dismissed his stories as old-timer superstitions, but sitting in that endless loop of road, I started to wonder if he'd known something I didn't. I decided to try something different. Instead of fighting the loop, trying to escape it or understand it, I would acknowledge it, respect it, maybe even ask for permission to leave. It sounds crazy, I know. But I was out of rational options, and sometimes crazy is all you have left. I stopped my truck at the exact center of the loop, about 5 miles from either end, and climbed down from the cab. The forest was completely silent, no birds, no insects, no wind in the trees. Just that deep cathedral quiet you only find in truly ancient places. I walked a few steps into the trees and spoke out loud, feeling foolish but desperate enough to try anything. "I don't know if anyone or anything is listening," I said, "but I'm lost here and I need help. I'm not trying to harm this place or disturb anything. I'm just trying to deliver some equipment to people who are studying your forest, people who want to protect it and understand it better. If I've somehow offended you or broken some rule I don't understand, I apologize. I just want to complete my delivery and get home safely." I waited for several minutes, listening to the silence, feeling somewhat ridiculous for talking to trees. But then gradually the normal sounds of the forest began to return. Birds calling to each other in the canopy above, the rustle of small animals moving through underbrush, the whisper of wind through branches. I got back in my truck and started driving again. This time, as I passed the 5-mile mark, I noticed a side road I hadn't seen before. It was narrow, barely wide enough for my truck, but it looked like it headed in the general direction of the research station. I took the side road, and after about 3 miles of careful navigation through tight turns and overhanging branches, I emerged into a clearing where the research station sat, exactly where it should have been. The scientists were waiting for me, worried because I was several hours late. "We were about to send someone to look for you," the project leader said as I backed up to the loading dock. "The access road is pretty straightforward. Did you have trouble finding us?" I looked at my watch. It showed 4:20 p.m., only 5 minutes later than when I'd first realized I was in the loop. Somehow, hours of driving in circles had taken only 5 minutes of real time. "Just took a scenic route," I said, not sure how to explain what had really happened. I unloaded the equipment, got my delivery receipt signed, and prepared to leave. The project leader gave me directions back to the main road, the same directions I'd followed on the way in, but now they led directly back to civilization without any mysterious loops or dead ends. As I drove away from the research station, I stopped at the intersection where I'd first turned onto the access road. Forest Service marker 47 was there just like always, but now there was something else. A small wooden sign I'd never noticed before, weather-beaten and partially covered by moss. I climbed down from my truck to read it. Ancient Forest Protection Area. Travel by permission only. Show respect and you will find your way. Show disrespect and you will find only confusion. The sign looked like it had been there for decades, but I was certain I'd never seen it before. And I've been driving that route regularly for 8 years. I've made several more deliveries to that research station since then, and the road has always been straightforward and direct. 10 miles from the main road to the facility, just like it's supposed to be. But I always stop at that intersection and read the sign, just to remind myself that there are places in this world that operate by different rules than the ones we think we understand. And sometimes when I'm driving through deep forest on roads that don't see much traffic, I remember my grandfather's stories about the forest being alive, about places that hide from maps and compass readings, about the importance of showing respect to things we don't fully comprehend. Because some roads only let you travel them if you understand that you're a guest, not a conqueror. And some loops aren't traps. They're tests, designed to see if you're worthy of reaching your destination. I passed the test eventually. But it took humility, respect, and the willingness to admit that a truck driver from the 21st century might not know everything about navigating a forest that's been growing since long before humans arrived on this continent. Sometimes the old ways are the right ways, and sometimes when you're lost, the best thing you can do is stop trying to find your way and start asking for permission to continue your journey. And I've been making runs to remote communities throughout the Pacific Northwest for 7 years now. It's specialized work, delivering supplies to places that can only be reached by truck, small towns, and isolated facilities that depend on drivers like me to keep them connected to the outside world. The pay is good, but you earn every dollar driving on narrow mountain roads, dealing with weather that can change from clear to dangerous in minutes, and spending long hours alone in some of the most remote terrain in the continental United States. I've always felt comfortable in isolated places. Maybe it's because I grew up in a small town myself, or maybe it's just temperament. But the solitude and beauty of the Pacific Northwest wilderness has never bothered me. If anything, I find it peaceful. There's something about driving through old-growth forests and alongside wild rivers that makes the stress of urban life seem insignificant. But what happened on Highway 14 along the Columbia River Gorge last October changed my perspective on being alone in remote places. It was October 27th, about 4:30 in the morning, and I was running westbound with a load of medical supplies for a clinic in a small town near the mouth of the Columbia River. I'd started the run from Spokane the previous evening, driven through the night to make the delivery during the clinic's morning hours. The road along the river is beautiful during the day, but at night it can be challenging. Narrow, winding, with steep drops to the water on one side and rocky canyon walls on the other. The weather had been clear when I left Spokane, but as I descended into the Columbia Gorge, I hit a thick bank of mist rising from the river. It wasn't unusual. The Columbia generates its own weather patterns, especially during the transition between seasons. But this mist was denser than normal, reducing visibility to maybe 20 or 30 feet and giving everything an otherworldly, dreamlike quality. I slowed down to about 25 miles per hour, hazard lights flashing, and focused on following the center line. The mist seemed to muffle sound as well as block vision, creating an almost complete sensory isolation. No traffic, no wind, no sound of water from the river below. Just the low rumble of my diesel engine and the whisper of tires on wet asphalt. I'd been driving in these conditions for maybe 20 minutes when I first saw them. Eyes reflecting my headlight beams visible for just a moment before disappearing into the mist. My first thought was wildlife, deer, elk, maybe a bear wandering down from the canyon walls to drink from the river. But the eyes were wrong for wildlife. Too high off the ground, too wide set, and they didn't move the way animal eyes move. When deer or elk are caught in headlights, they usually freeze for a moment, then bound away in obvious panic. These eyes just watched, steady, unblinking, and at about the same height as a standing person. I slowed down even more, not wanting to hit an animal or a person who might have wandered onto the road. The eyes appeared again, closer this time, definitely at human eye level, but still too far apart to be human. And they seemed to track my truck as it passed, turning to follow my movement like they belonged to someone walking parallel to the road. Then I saw a second pair, then a third, all at the same height, all the same distance from the road, all tracking my movement with the same steady, unblinking attention. I reached for my CB radio thinking maybe I should warn other drivers. about people walking near the highway in dangerous conditions. But as I lifted the microphone, I realized how strange my report would sound. There are people with unusually wide-set eyes walking in the mist along Highway 14. Even as I was experiencing it, it sounded crazy. The eyes multiplied as I drove deeper into the mist. Not just a few scattered pairs, but dozens of them lining both sides of the road like an honor guard. They appeared and disappeared as my headlight beams swept back and forth. But they were always there, always watching, always maintaining that same impossible spacing and height. I started counting them, more out of nervousness than real curiosity. By the time I'd driven another mile, I'd counted at least 40 pairs of eyes, all behaving in exactly the same way. No variation in height, no random movement, no sign of the individual behavior you'd expect from a group of people or animals. That's when I realized they weren't reflecting my headlights at all. They were glowing with their own light, a soft blue-white radiance that was clearly visible even when my headlight beams weren't pointed directly at them. And they were moving, not walking alongside the road, but flowing like they were floating just above the ground. I pulled over at the next wide spot I could find, heart racing, hands shaking on the steering wheel. The mist was so thick I couldn't see more than a few feet beyond my windshield, but I could sense the eyes out there, surrounding my truck, watching and waiting. I turned off my engine and rolled down my window, listening for any sound that might explain what I was seeing. Footsteps, voices, anything that would suggest a rational explanation for dozens of glowing eyes in the Columbia River mist. What I heard instead was singing. It was faint at first, almost lost in the mist-muffled silence, but gradually it became clearer. Not words I could understand, but a melody that was both beautiful and deeply sad, like a lullaby sung by someone who had lost everything they loved. Multiple voices harmonizing in ways that suggested a culture and musical tradition I'd never encountered. The singing grew louder as more voices joined in, creating a sound that seemed to come from the mist itself rather than from any specific location. And as the music surrounded me, the eyes began to move closer to my truck. I should have been terrified. Every rational part of my mind was screaming at me to start the engine and get away from whatever was surrounding me in the mist. But the music was so beautiful, so filled with longing and sorrow that I found myself crying instead of running. I wiped the tears from my eyes and looked around more carefully. The eyes were now close enough that I could see they belonged to figures in the mist. Tall, slender shapes that seemed to be made of condensed fog rather than solid matter. They moved with a fluid grace that was definitely not human, but their posture and gesture suggested intelligence, even kindness. One of them approached my truck, moving close enough that I could see more details. It was definitely humanoid, but elongated, with features that seemed both ancient and timeless. Its eyes, the source of that soft blue-white glow, were larger than human eyes and filled with an expression I can only describe as profound sadness mixed with gentle curiosity. It reached out toward my truck, and I instinctively rolled my window down further, not sure why, but feeling like it was the right thing to do. Its hand, or what passed for a hand, was cool and dry, more like touching morning mist than solid flesh, but I could definitely feel it. For a moment that seemed to last hours, we simply looked at each other. I felt no fear, only a deep sense of connection to something far older and more mysterious than anything I'd ever encountered. The singing continued around us, and I had the strange impression that this figure was trying to communicate with me. Not through words, but through emotions and images that formed directly in my mind. I saw the Columbia River as it had been centuries ago, before dams and development changed its character. I saw people living along its banks, people who looked like the figure touching my hand, existing in harmony with the river and the land around it. I saw their homes, their families, their ways of life that had persisted for thousands of years. And then I saw the changes. The arrival of new people, the building of roads and towns, the gradual displacement of the original inhabitants. Not through violence or conquest, but through the simple fact that two different ways of life couldn't occupy the same space. The river people faded away, not dying but becoming less solid, less present, until they existed mainly in the mist that rises from the water they had always called home. The figure released my hand and stepped back into the mist. The singing began to fade, and the dozens of glowing eyes started to disappear one by one, like stars being covered by clouds. Within minutes, I was alone again, sitting in my truck on the side of Highway 14 with nothing but thick mist and silence around me. I started my engine and continued toward my destination. But the rest of the drive felt different. The mist began to clear as I got farther from the river and normal sounds returned. Wind, water, the distant noise of early morning traffic. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been granted a glimpse into a world that exists parallel to our own, inhabited by beings who watch us from the spaces between what we consider real. When I reached the clinic and made my delivery, I asked the staff about local history, specifically about the indigenous people who had lived along the river before European settlement. The nurse I spoke with was Native American herself, a member of one of the local tribes, and she listened carefully to my description of what I'd experienced. "You saw the river spirits," she said matter-of-factly. "They're not ghosts exactly, more like guardians. They watch over the river and the people who travel on it. Most people never see them, but sometimes when the mist is heavy and the conditions are right, they make themselves known to drivers who treat their territory with respect." She explained that the Columbia River Gorge has always been considered a sacred place, a boundary between the physical world and the spirit world. The river spirits had been reported by travelers for generations, usually appearing as lights or eyes in the mist, sometimes as figures that seemed to be made of fog and starlight. "Why did they show themselves to me?" I asked. She smiled. "Maybe because you stopped instead of just driving through. Maybe because you listened to their singing instead of being afraid. They can sense respect and they respond to it. I've driven Highway 14 dozens of times since that night, and I've never seen the river spirits again, but I always slow down when I hit patches of mist, and I always pay attention to the river flowing alongside the road. And sometimes, when the conditions are just right, I think I can hear faint traces of that beautiful, sad singing carried on the wind from the water. I keep a small bundle of sage in my truck now, something the nurse at the clinic suggested as a way of showing respect for the spirits who watch over the river. And whenever I make a delivery to one of the small communities along the Columbia, I take a moment to acknowledge the original inhabitants of this land, the river people who faded into mist but never really left. Because some eyes in the darkness aren't watching you with malicious intent. Sometimes they're just checking to make sure you understand that you're traveling through a place that's sacred to someone, even if that someone isn't quite human anymore. And sometimes, if you show the right kind of respect, they'll let you glimpse the beauty and sadness of a world that exists just beyond the edges of our ordinary vision, where ancient songs still echo in the mist and eyes full of starlight keep watch over travelers who journey through their domain. Rick Sullivan speaking, and what I'm about to tell you is the reason I still drive these mountain roads. Even though what happened up on Snoqualmie Pass 3 winters ago should have scared me away from the profession forever. But sometimes an experience that starts as the most terrifying night of your life ends up becoming the most meaningful, and you realize you've been part of something larger than yourself. Something that connects you to every other driver who's ever tried to help a stranger in trouble. February 14th, 2022, Valentine's Day, which should have been ironic considering I was spending it alone in a truck cab instead of with family. But there was nothing romantic about that night. It was one of the worst winter storms to hit the Cascades in decades, with snow falling at 2 inches an hour and winds gusting up to 70 miles per hour. The Washington State Patrol had closed I-90 twice during the day, opening it only for essential traffic between weather bands. I was hauling medical supplies to a hospital in Ellensburg, the kind of emergency run that can't wait for better weather. Insulin, blood products, oxygen equipment. Stuff that people would literally die without. The dispatcher had given me a choice: wait out the storm in Seattle and risk missing the delivery window, or attempt the pass and hope the conditions didn't get worse. I chose to drive. I've been running these mountain roads for 18 years, have a perfect safety record, and I trust my equipment and my skills. But as I climbed into the high elevations around Snoqualmie Pass, I started wondering if I'd made a serious mistake. The snow was coming down so hard my wipers could barely keep up. The road was barely visible, more guessed at than actually seen, and the wind was rocking my trailer badly enough that I was fighting to keep it in my lane. I had my speed down to maybe 20 miles per hour, hazards flashing, following the dim outline of guardrails and hoping I wouldn't encounter any abandoned vehicles or accidents ahead of me. I was about 5 miles from the summit when my CB radio crackled to life. "Mayday, Mayday, this is eastbound driver at milepost 52. I'm jackknifed across both lanes and I can't get my rig straightened out. I've got injuries and I need immediate assistance. Anyone out there, please respond." The voice was strained, clearly in pain, but trying to stay calm and professional. I grabbed my microphone immediately. "Driver in distress, this is Rick in a westbound freight liner about milepost 47. I'm heading your way. What's the nature of your injuries and what kind of assistance do you need?" "Rick, thank God. I took the curve too fast, tried to correct when I started sliding, and ended up jackknifed across the road. Trailers blocking both lanes completely. I think I broke some ribs when I hit the steering wheel and I'm bleeding from a head wound. I can't get out of the cab to assess the situation." I checked my GPS. Milepost 52 was about 10 minutes ahead at my current speed, right in the middle of one of the most dangerous sections of the pass. If his trailer was blocking both lanes, other vehicles could slam into him without warning in the limited visibility. "Can you get your hazard lights on? Set out flares or reflectors?" "Negative. Electrical system took a hit in the jackknife. No lights, no power. And I can't get my door open. It's jammed or iced shut." This was bad. A disabled truck blocking the road in near-zero visibility was a recipe for a multi-vehicle pileup that could kill dozens of people. I increased my speed slightly, pushing the safe limit for conditions while trying to think of a plan. "What's your truck and trailer configuration?" I asked. "How big an obstacle are we dealing with?" "Peterbilt 379 53-foot dry van. Cabs pointing southeast, trailer angled across the westbound lane and most of the eastbound. There's maybe 3 feet of clearance on the outside shoulder, but it's soft and there's a steep drop-off." I knew that exact spot. It's a curve with a significant grade, bordered by a canyon on one side and a rock wall on the other. No room for error, no easy way around a large obstacle, and definitely no place where a rescue vehicle could safely maneuver. "Okay, I'm going to try to reach you and see what we can do. State Patrol's not going to be able to get equipment up there in this weather, so we're going to have to handle this ourselves. Rick, I need to tell you something. This storm is getting worse fast. You shouldn't risk your life trying to help me. I made a stupid mistake and I don't want you to pay for it." "Not happening," I told him. "We don't leave drivers stranded, especially not with injuries." "I'm almost there." I crested the next hill and should have been able to see his emergency flashers, or at least the silhouette of his truck in my headlight beams. But the road ahead looked clear, just unbroken snow and the dark shapes of trees on either side of the highway. "Driver, I'm at milepost 52 and I don't see you. Can you give me more specific positioning?" I'm right at the mile marker, Rick. Big curve to the left, trailer blocking both lanes. You should be able to see me by now. I drove slowly through the curve he'd described, high beams cutting through the snow, looking for any sign of a disabled vehicle. Nothing. The road was completely clear. I'm not seeing you. Are you sure about your location? Positive. I can see the milepost from my cab. Rick, where are you? I'm losing a lot of blood here and I'm starting to get disoriented. The desperation in his voice was heartbreaking, but I was starting to worry that his head injury was worse than he'd indicated. Head trauma can cause confusion about location, time, even identity. Maybe he thought he was at milepost 52 but was actually somewhere else entirely. I drove another 5 miles, checking every curve, every wide spot, every place where a truck could potentially jackknife. No sign of any accident, no disabled vehicle, no marks in the snow to indicate that anything had happened. Driver, I've covered the area from milepost 50 to milepost 55 and I'm not finding you. Is it possible you're confused about your location? Head injuries can affect perception. I'm not confused, Rick. I'm at milepost 52 and I'm hurt bad. Please don't give up on me. His voice was getting weaker, more strained. If he was really injured and bleeding, time was critical. But I couldn't help someone I couldn't find. I tried a different approach. What can you see from your cab? Describe the terrain, any landmarks, anything that might help me locate you. Trees on both sides, steep drop to the right, rock wall to the left, the curve where everyone takes it too fast in weather like this. That described half the curves on Snoqualmie Pass. I needed more specific information. Can you see any other vehicles? Any lights besides mine? No other traffic. Just your headlights. Wait, Rick, are you the truck that just passed me? I felt ice in my veins. I hadn't passed any other vehicles. I was alone on the road. Negative, I haven't passed anyone. I've been looking for you for the last 20 minutes. Silence on the radio for almost a minute. Then, very quietly, Rick, what year is it? The question was so unexpected that I didn't answer immediately. When I did, my voice was barely steady. It's 2022, February 14th, 2022. Another long silence. Then, no, that's not right. It's 2021, February 14th, 2021. I was making a Valentine's Day delivery to Ellensburg, medical supplies that couldn't wait for better weather. My hands started shaking on the steering wheel. February 14th, 2021. Exactly 1 year ago. I remembered that storm. It had been even worse than this one, with multiple fatalities on mountain passes throughout the state. What's your name? I asked, though I was already afraid of the answer. Danny Morrison. I've been driving for State Medical Supply out of Seattle for 12 years. Rick, something's wrong here. Something's very wrong. I pulled over at the next safe spot and grabbed my smartphone, praying for enough signal to access the internet. It took several minutes, but I finally managed to load a search page and typed in Danny Morrison truck accident, Snoqualmie Pass, February 2021. The results made me sick to my stomach. Danny Morrison, 43 years old, had jackknifed his medical supply truck during the Valentine's Day blizzard of 2021. His truck had blocked both lanes of I-90 at milepost 52, and he'd been trapped in his cab for over an hour with serious injuries while rescue crews tried to reach him in impossible conditions. He died of internal bleeding before help arrived. The accident report noted that Morrison had made several radio calls for assistance, but the storm had prevented other drivers from locating his position. He'd spent his final hour trying to flag down help that never came. Now, exactly 1 year later, he was trying again. I keyed my microphone with trembling fingers. Danny, I need you to listen to me very carefully. You did jackknife your truck on February 14th, but that was a year ago. You didn't make it, Danny. You died waiting for help that couldn't reach you. That's not possible. he said, but his voice was uncertain now. I'm hurt, but I'm alive. I can feel the pain, I can see the snow, I can hear your voice. You're trying to save someone else, Danny. There's going to be an avalanche. Right, where you jackknifed in about 15 minutes. A massive snowslide that's going to bury the roadway completely. As soon as I said it, I knew it was true. The weather conditions were identical to the year before, the snowpack was unstable, and the mountainside above milepost 52 had been flagged as high risk for avalanches. Rick, you need to get away from here. Don't come looking for me. Turn around and get back to safety. I can't do that, Danny. I've got medical supplies that a hospital needs. The hospital can wait. People will die if you don't turn around right now. I looked ahead at the road climbing toward the summit, then at my cargo of life-saving medical supplies. The choice should have been easy. Complete my delivery. Help the living. Ignore the voice of someone who had died a year ago. But something about Danny's desperation, his determination to save me from the fate he'd suffered, made the choice for me. I turned my truck around. I was maybe 2 miles back down the mountain when I heard the rumble. Not thunder, avalanche. A massive wall of snow and debris roaring down the mountainside, burying the highway exactly where Danny Morrison had jackknifed his truck 12 months earlier. If I'd continued on my original route, I would have been at milepost 52 when the avalanche hit. I would have been buried under tons of snow, probably killed instantly, just another victim of the dangerous mountain weather. Instead, I was safe, warned by a driver who had died trying to help others and was still trying to help others a year later. I spent the night in North Bend waiting for the avalanche to be cleared and the road to reopen. The medical supplies reached Ellensburg 18 hours late, but the hospital staff assured me that the delay hadn't caused any critical problems. I never heard Danny Morrison's voice on the radio again, but I did some research into his life. He'd been exactly the kind of driver you'd want on the road, safe, professional, always willing to help other drivers in trouble. He'd left behind a wife and 2 teenage daughters, all of whom said he'd never met a stranger, never passed someone who needed help. Danny had spent his last hour trying to get help for himself, but when he got a second chance, he used it to help someone else instead. He saved my life by telling me to turn around, to avoid the avalanche that would have buried me just like it buried the spot where he died. I still drive Snoqualmie Pass regularly, and I always slow down when I pass milepost 52. There's a small memorial there now installed by Danny's family with a plaque that reads, "In memory of drivers who didn't make it home. Drive safely." But I know Danny Morrison did make it home in a way. He made it to wherever good drivers go when they're done with earthly roads, and he's still looking out for the rest of us who are still hauling freight through dangerous mountains in dangerous weather. Because some voices on the radio are more than just radio calls. They're lifelines thrown by people who understand what it means to be alone on a dark road, fighting weather and terrain and the limitations of human machinery to get essential cargo where it needs to go. And sometimes, just sometimes, the best drivers are the ones who are no longer driving, but who remember what it felt like to be in trouble and alone, and who use whatever power they have left to make sure other drivers make it home safely. Danny Morrison's last call saved my life, and every time I key my microphone to help another driver in distress, I'm passing on the gift he gave me, the knowledge that we're all connected out here. All responsible for each other and all part of something larger than any single load or any single trip. Some calls for help come from the past, but they're answered in the present by drivers who understand that the most important cargo we carry is our obligation to each other. Story 10. The Way Station That Weighs Souls. Carl Heavy Henderson speaking, and I've been driving oversized loads for 23 years. When you're hauling equipment that weighs 120,000 pounds and requires permits from 3 different states, you get real familiar with weigh stations. Every scale, every inspection protocol, every DOT officer from Seattle to Sacramento. I know them all by name, know their procedures, know exactly what they're looking for when they wave you onto the platform. So when I pulled into the Tumwater Way station on I-5 last March at 11:47 p.m. and found it staffed by officers I'd never seen before using equipment that looked like it belonged in a museum, I should have known something was wrong. March 18, 2024, I was southbound with a massive industrial generator bound for a data center in California. The load was legal but pushing every weight limit, requiring me to use only designated truck routes and stop at every open-way station. I'd been driving for 9 hours and was looking forward to my mandatory rest period when I saw the "All Trucks Must Stop" sign illuminated at the Tumwater facility. The station should have been closed at that hour. Washington DOT runs skeleton crews after 10 p.m., and most facilities just use automated systems to pre-screen trucks through transponders. But there were lights on in the building, official-looking vehicles in the parking lot, and a uniformed officer directing me onto the scale. I pulled forward slowly, watching my mirrors to make sure the trailer was properly positioned. The scale platform looked different than I remembered, older with analog gauges instead of digital readouts, and made of steel that showed decades of rust and wear. The building itself seemed smaller, more cramped, with windows that were dusty and dark despite the lights I'd seen from the highway. The officer who approached my cab looked authentic enough. Washington State Patrol uniform, proper patches and badges, the kind of weathered face you'd expect from someone who'd spent years dealing with truckers who were trying to bend the rules. But something about him bothered me. His uniform looked old-fashioned, like something from the 1980s, and he moved with the stiff mechanical precision of someone following a script, rather than doing a familiar job. "Evening, driver," he said, clipboard in hand. "Routine inspection. Please shut off your engine and provide your logbook, bill of lading, and permit documents." I handed over the paperwork, noting that his clipboard was also old-style, actual paper forms instead of the electronic tablets that most agencies had switched to years ago. He examined my documents with unusual thoroughness, checking and rechecking details that should have been straightforward. "Sir, this load shows 115,000 pounds on your manifest," he said. "But our scale is reading significantly higher. You're going to need to step down while we conduct a more detailed inspection." I climbed out of the cab, confused because I'd had the load weighed twice before leaving Washington, and both scales had confirmed I was within legal limits. But the analog gauges on this ancient scale showed numbers that didn't make sense. Not just overweight, but impossibly heavy, like I was hauling lead instead of aluminum and steel. "There must be some mistake," I said. "This equipment was professionally weighed and permitted. I've got documentation showing exact weights and distributions." The officer ignored me, walking around my truck and trailer with that same mechanical precision, making notes on forms that looked like they hadn't been updated in decades. 2 more officers emerged from the building, also in old-style uniforms, also moving with that strange, scripted quality. "Driver, we're going to need you to disconnect your trailer and move your tractor off the scale," one of them said. "This load is significantly overweight and improperly secured. We're impounding the vehicle pending a full investigation." This was wrong on multiple levels. My load was legal, properly permitted, and secured according to DOT specifications. But more importantly, no state agency could simply impound a commercial vehicle without following proper procedures, providing documentation, and allowing the driver to contact his company or attorney. "Officers, I need to see your supervisor," I said. "This load has been inspected twice and approved by your own permit office. I want someone in authority to explain what's happening here." The 3 officers looked at each other, and for a moment their synchronized movements reminded me more of actors who'd forgotten their lines than law enforcement professionals doing their jobs. Then the first officer smiled, but it wasn't a human expression. It was too wide, too empty, like someone had taught him that smiling involved showing as many teeth as possible. "Driver, you're not understanding the situation," he said. "This isn't about your cargo. This is about you." He pointed to the scale readout, and I saw something that made my blood turn to ice water. The numbers weren't showing the weight of my truck and trailer. They were showing declining figures, dropping steadily like a countdown timer. 247 pounds, 246 pounds, 245 pounds. "What is that measuring?" I asked, though I was already afraid I knew the answer. "Standard procedure," the officer said, still wearing that inhuman smile. "We weigh everything that passes through here. Trucks, trailers, cargo, and drivers. Most drivers weigh exactly what they should. Body weight, nothing more, nothing less. But some drivers are carrying extra weight, guilt, regret, the weight of choices they made that hurt other people." The numbers kept dropping. 244 pounds, 243 pounds. My actual body weight was 195 pounds, and I hadn't gained 50 pounds of anything, physical or emotional. "This is insane," I said. "Scales don't measure guilt. They measure physical mass. This equipment is malfunctioning." "Is it?" asked the second officer. "Carl Henderson, age 47, driving commercially for 23 years. On April 15, 2003, you were running behind schedule on a delivery to Portland. You were driving too fast for conditions, following too closely, and when the car ahead of you stopped suddenly, you didn't have room to brake safely." My mouth went dry. April 15th, 2003. I tried to forget that date for over 20 years, but it was burned into my memory like a brand. The accident that should have ended my career, should have landed me in prison, but somehow got ruled a no-fault incident due to poor road conditions and inadequate signage. The Honda Civic you rear-ended was driven by Margaret Chen, age 34, mother of 2 young children. She was on her way to pick up her daughter from dance class when you pushed her car into the intersection, where it was struck by a delivery truck. 239 pounds, 238 pounds. The scale was somehow measuring the weight of 21 years of guilt, 21 years of knowing that my impatience and reckless driving had killed an innocent woman and destroyed her family. Margaret Chen died instantly, the third officer continued. Her daughter waited at the dance studio for 3 hours before someone came to tell her that Mommy wouldn't be picking her up. Ever. I wanted to run, to get back in my truck and drive away from this nightmare way station, but my legs felt like they were made of lead. The officers surrounded me, still wearing those empty smiles, still reciting details about the worst moment of my life. "The investigation found no criminal fault," the first officer said. "Wet roads, poor visibility, mechanical failure of the traffic signal. But you know the truth, don't you, Carl? You were driving too fast because you wanted to get home early. You were following too closely because you were impatient with slower traffic. You killed Margaret Chen because you decided your schedule was more important than her life. 234 pounds. 233 pounds. The weight of my conscience measured in pounds of guilt and regret, displayed on a scale that shouldn't have been able to detect anything beyond physical matter. "What do you want from me?" I whispered. "Justice," they said in unison. Margaret Chen never got justice. Her children grew up without a mother. Her husband spent years in therapy trying to understand why good people die while reckless drivers face no consequences. The system failed them, but some scales are more accurate than others. I realized then that I was going to die at this way station, that these weren't real officers but something else entirely. Something that had been waiting 21 years for me to drive through their jurisdiction so they could collect a debt that the legal system had never made me pay. But as the scale reading dropped toward 200 pounds, something unexpected happened. I started talking. "You're right," I said. "I killed her. I've known it every day for 21 years. I wake up every morning remembering the sound of metal hitting metal, the sight of her car spinning into that intersection, the knowledge that if I'd been driving just 5 miles per hour slower, she'd still be alive." The officers stopped moving, stopped smiling, just stood there listening as I continued. "I've tried to make amends the only way I knew how. I've driven over 2 million miles since that day without a single moving violation. I've stopped to help hundreds of stranded drivers, pulled people from burning vehicles, called in accidents before they became tragedies. I've donated money to traffic safety organizations, volunteered with victim advocacy groups, done everything I could think of to try to balance the scales. The numbers on the display slowed their descent. 201 pounds, 200 pounds, 199 pounds. I know it's not enough," I said, tears streaming down my face. "Nothing I do will ever bring Margaret Chen back to her children. But I've spent every day trying to be the kind of driver I should have been that night, trying to make sure no one else dies because of my mistakes. 195 pounds. The display stopped changing. The officers looked at each other again, but this time their expressions were different. Confused, uncertain, like they'd expected a different outcome. The first officer checked his clipboard, frowned, and approached the scale controls. "The reading is incorrect," he said, but his voice had lost that mechanical quality. "It should be higher. The guilt should weigh more." "Maybe," I said, "guilt isn't the only thing you can measure. Maybe redemption has weight too. Maybe the lives I've saved, the accidents I've prevented, the safe miles I've driven. Maybe those things count for something." The scale platform began to vibrate, then shake violently, like it was having some kind of mechanical failure. The analog gauges spun wildly, the lights in the building flickered, and the 3 officers began to fade like morning mist touched by sunlight. "This isn't over," the first officer said as he became translucent. "Some debts can't be paid with good intentions." "You're right," I said. "But some debts can be paid with a lifetime of better choices. And I've got more good miles left in me." The way station dissolved around me like a movie set being struck. The old scale platform, the vintage building, the officers with their clipboards and empty smiles, all of it faded away, replaced by the familiar modern facility I'd expected to find. Digital scales, electronic signs, automated systems, and not a human being in sight. My truck and trailer were sitting on the platform exactly as I'd positioned them, and the digital readout showed my correct weight, 115,000 pounds, well within legal limits. The timestamp on the scale ticket read 11:52 p.m., only 5 minutes after I'd pulled in, though the encounter with the phantom officers had felt like hours. I printed my scale ticket, got back in my truck, and continued south toward California. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd been tested by something beyond human law enforcement, judged by scales that measured more than physical weight, and somehow found worthy to continue my journey. I've been through the Tumwater Way station dozens of times since that night, always during normal business hours when real officers are on duty. But sometimes late at night when I'm driving past closed facilities and empty scales, I remember the weight of guilt, the possibility of redemption, and the knowledge that some debts follow us longer than we expect, until we prove that we've learned to carry them properly. Margaret Chen died because I made selfish choices 21 years ago. That's a weight I'll carry until my last mile. But maybe after that night at the Phantom Way station, I'm carrying it better. Not as a burden that drags me down, but as a responsibility that keeps me driving safely, helping others, and remembering that every mile matters to someone. Some scales measure what you're carrying. Others measure what's carrying you. Betty Rodriguez here, and I've been driving independent owner-operator for 14 years, hauling specialty loads between small towns and forgotten places that the big freight companies won't service. It's a niche market. Art installations for rural galleries, medical equipment for isolated clinics, custom machinery for family farms that have been working the same land for generations. The money's decent, and I like being my own boss, making my own schedule, choosing routes that take me through parts of America that most people never see. But sometimes those routes take you to places that shouldn't exist, where the rules of geography and commerce don't apply, where a simple fuel stop becomes something that haunts your dreams for months afterward. November 2nd, 2023, I was running a load of solar panels from Portland to a small town in eastern Oregon, way out in the high desert where cell phone coverage is spotty and gas stations are 60 miles apart. I'd planned my fuel stops carefully, knowing that running out of diesel in that empty country could mean waiting hours for assistance, if help came at all. I was about 40 miles past Bend, following Highway 20 through country that looked like the surface of Mars, when my fuel gauge started dropping faster than it should have. Not a leak. I would have smelled diesel. But something was wrong with either my fuel system or my calculations. Either way, I was burning through my reserves faster than expected, and the next planned fuel stop was still 30 miles ahead. That's when I saw the sign. Desert Rose Truck Stop, diesel, food, repairs, next right. I didn't remember seeing that fuel stop on my route planning, but that wasn't unusual. Small independent stations come and go in rural areas, and sometimes they're not listed in the standard trucking directories. The important thing was that it was real, it was close, and it promised diesel fuel. I took the exit, which led to a well-maintained paved road that curved through a landscape of sagebrush and scattered juniper trees. After about 2 miles, I crested a small hill and saw the Desert Rose truck stop spread out below me like an oasis in the wasteland. It was beautiful, in an old-fashioned way. The main building was designed to look like a 1950s roadside diner, complete with neon signs and chrome fixtures that gleamed in the afternoon sun. There were 6 diesel pumps under a covered canopy, all marked with prices that seemed reasonable for such a remote location. A dozen parking spaces for big rigs, most of them occupied by trucks that looked well-maintained and professional. But as I pulled up to the fuel island, I noticed something strange. The trucks parked around the facility were all vintage models. Not restored classics, but working trucks from the 1970s and 80s that looked like they'd been perfectly preserved. Kenworth W900s with long hoods and chrome exhausts. Peterbilt 359s with hand-painted graphics and custom sleeper berths. The kind of iron that old-school drivers called real trucks, before aerodynamics and fuel efficiency requirements changed the industry forever. I pulled up to pump number 4, shut down my engine, and climbed out to fuel up. The pump looked modern enough with digital displays and credit card readers, but when I swiped my card, it prompted me to see cashier instead of processing the transaction. The inside of the Desert Rose was like stepping back in time. Black and white checkered floors, red vinyl booths, a lunch counter with chrome stools, and a jukebox that was playing Hank Williams while truckers in vintage gear sat at tables discussing routes and loads in the easy camaraderie of professional drivers. The cashier was a woman in her 60s with silver hair piled high and a uniform that matched the retro aesthetic of the place. Her name tag read Rose, and she greeted me with the kind of warm smile that made you feel like family. "Welcome to the Desert Rose, honey," she said. "First time through?" "Yes, ma'am," I said, handing over my credit card. "Just need to fuel up, about 40 gallons on pump 4. She ran my card through an old-fashioned manual imprinter, the kind that makes carbon copies, and handed me a receipt to sign. You're driving that pretty blue Freightliner out there. That's a nice rig. Don't see many women drivers these days. I looked around the diner, noting that she was right. Every other driver in the place was male, and they all looked like they'd stepped out of trucking magazines from decades past. But they were friendly enough, nodding in my direction and going back to their conversations about highway conditions and freight rates. "How long have you been here?" I asked Rose as she processed my fuel purchase. "Oh, seems like forever," she said. "My husband built this place back in '73. Figured the highway needed a good truck stop where drivers could get decent fuel, hot food, and honest service. He passed on about 10 years ago, but I kept it running. These drivers, they're like family, you know? They look out for each other and they look out for me." I paid for my fuel and was heading back to my truck when one of the drivers, a man in his 60s wearing a faded Peterbilt cap, approached me. "You be careful out there, miss," he said. "Highway gets tricky after dark, especially for drivers who don't know the area." "I appreciate the advice," I said. "I'm just running to Burns, should be there before sunset." He frowned. "Burns? That's a long way from here, better part of 200 miles through some rough country. You sure about your route?" I was sure. Burns was maybe 60 miles from where we stood, an easy 2-hour drive on good highway. But I didn't want to argue with a local driver who was trying to be helpful. "I've got GPS and good directions," I said. "But thanks for the concern." He shook his head. "GPS don't work too good out here, miss. Satellites get confused by the mountains. You stick to Highway 20, don't take any shortcuts, and you should be fine." I fueled up my truck, checked my route one more time, and pulled back onto the highway. But as I drove away from the desert rows, I noticed something that made me uneasy. According to my truck's GPS, I was exactly where I should be, following Highway 20 eastbound toward Burns. But the landscape looked wrong, different from what I remembered passing on my way to the fuel stop. The terrain was more mountainous, with pine forests instead of desert sagebrush. The road itself seemed older, narrower, with the kind of worn asphalt and faded lane markings that suggested decades of use without major renovation. And the mile markers, when I could spot them, showed numbers that didn't match what my GPS was displaying. I pulled over at the next wide spot and checked my paper maps, the old-fashioned atlases that experienced drivers keep as backup when electronic systems fail. According to the map, there was no Desert Rose truck stop on Highway 20. No exit where I'd turned off. No side road leading to a 1950s-style diner. No fuel island where I'd just pumped 40 gallons of diesel. But my fuel gauge showed a full tank, and my receipt showed a charge from Desert Rose truck stop, dated and signed in Rose's handwriting. I called my dispatcher, hoping to get some guidance, but my cell phone showed no signal. Not unusual in remote areas, but frustrating when you're trying to figure out if you're lost or losing your mind. I decided to continue eastbound, figuring I'd eventually reach familiar landmarks that would help me get oriented. But after an hour of driving through increasingly mountainous terrain that looked nothing like the high desert country I'd been expecting, I started to worry that I'd somehow gotten onto the wrong highway entirely. That's when I saw the other truck. It was maybe half a mile ahead of me. A vintage Kenworth W900 with a distinctive purple and gold paint scheme that I'd noticed at the Desert Rose. As I got closer, I could see it was the same driver who'd warned me about road conditions, the older man in the Peterbilt cap. I tried to raise him on the CB radio. "Eastbound KW with the purple stripes, this is Betty and the blue Freightliner behind you. You got your ears on?" His voice crackled back immediately. "Hey there, Betty. Good to hear from you. How you making out on this old road?" "I'm a little confused about my location," I admitted. "My GPS says I'm on Highway 20, but this doesn't look like the country I was expecting." "GPS don't work out here," he repeated. "This is the old highway. the route we used to run before they built the interstate. Takes longer, but it's prettier country and the road's still good if you know how to drive it. Old highway? I thought Highway 20 was the current route. A pause then. Miss, what year do you think it is? The question was so unexpected that I didn't answer immediately. When I did, my voice was uncertain. It's 2023, November 2nd, 2023. Another pause, longer this time. Then, Betty, I need you to listen to me real careful. You fueled up at Rose's place, didn't you? Talked to her about the old days, maybe met some of the regular drivers. Yes, why? Because Rose's truck stop burned down in 1984. Electrical fire took the whole place, killed Rose and 3 drivers who were sleeping in their cabs. Highway department moved the route after that, built the new section that bypasses the area entirely. I felt cold, despite the afternoon sun streaming through my windshield. That's not possible. I was just there an hour ago. I bought fuel, talked to Rose, got a receipt. Check your fuel gauge, Betty. Check it real careful. I looked down at my instruments and my heart nearly stopped. The fuel gauge was reading exactly what it had been reading when I first spotted the Desert Rose sign. Not full, as it should have been after pumping 40 gallons, but showing the same low level that had made me worry about reaching the next station. I fumbled for the receipt in my pocket, the carbon copy that Rose had given me after running my credit card through her manual imprinter. The paper was there, but when I looked at it, the writing was fading, becoming lighter and more transparent even as I watched. "This isn't real," I whispered into the CB microphone. "Depends on what you mean by real," came the reply. "Rose is still there, still taking care of drivers who need help. But she's taking care of them the only way she can now." I looked ahead at the purple Kenworth, but it was becoming transparent, fading like a movie projection with the power slowly being turned down. "Are you—" "I've been dead since '79, the voice said, sounding sad but not frightened. "Jackknifed on this same stretch of road during an ice storm. But Rose, she looks after us. Gives us a place to rest, a place to remember what it was like when driving was about more than schedules and profit margins." The truck ahead of me disappeared completely, leaving me alone on a highway that was itself becoming less substantial, like it was made of morning mist instead of asphalt and concrete. "Betty," the voice continued, though I could no longer see its source, "you need to wake up now. You fell asleep at the wheel about 20 miles back. Your truck's drifting toward the shoulder and there's a steep drop-off ahead." I jerked awake in my cab, heart pounding, hands fighting to regain control of my steering wheel. My truck was indeed drifting toward the right shoulder of Highway 20, and beyond the guardrail was a 100-foot drop into a rocky canyon. I corrected my course, pulled over at the next safe spot, and sat there shaking for several minutes. I'd fallen asleep while driving, something that could have killed me and anyone unlucky enough to be sharing the road. The Desert Rose, Rose herself, the vintage trucks and their drivers, all of it had been a dream, my subconscious mind's way of processing fatigue and the monotony of long-distance driving through empty country. But when I checked my fuel gauge, it was reading full, not the low level that had worried me before my micro-sleep, but completely full, like I'd just finished fueling up. I never found an explanation for that. My credit card statement never showed a charge from any Desert Rose truck stop. There was no receipt in my pocket, no evidence that I'd stopped anywhere between Bend and my current location. But my fuel tank was full and that diesel carried me all the way to Burns and back to Portland without another stop. Sometimes when I'm driving through remote country late at night, fighting fatigue and the hypnotic rhythm of highway miles, I remember Rose and her truck stop that exists somewhere between waking and sleeping, between the old roads and the new ones. I remember the drivers who gather there, sharing stories and looking out for each other the way truckers always have, even when they no longer need fuel for trucks that no longer run on earthly highways. And I remember that sometimes when you're in real danger of making a fatal mistake, help comes from the most unexpected places, even from people who've been dead for decades but who still remember what it means to take care of fellow drivers who are far from home and fighting to stay safe on dangerous roads. The Desert Rose truck stop may have burned down in 1984, but Rose is still there, still serving coffee and diesel fuel and second chances to drivers who need them most. You just have to be asleep to find her. And sometimes being asleep is exactly what saves your life.